So hello everybody, welcome to another of my episodes of What Makes You Click, and I'm very pleased this afternoon or today, depending on which time zone you're in, etc. My guest today is Simon Gadbois, who I've always thought of as Simon Gadbois, and then I realized that he's bilingual and French Canadian, so it's really Simon. So welcome, Simon. That's good as my French goes. And this is going to be different to some of the other ones that we've done. And this podcast has come about because actually Simon and I were going to go and do a seminar together. We thought it'd be quite cool to do one in North America, and then COVID struck and the rest is history, as they say. And before we sort of launch in, I just want to give people a little bit of background about you, and you can put me right when I get it wrong. But Simon has a fascinating backstory, and we might go into some of that in more detail. His father was a student of Piaget, and if you don't know who Piaget was, then look up child development, because that's where all the ideas come from pretty much. And he himself was a student of the late, great John Fentress. And again, if you don't know John Fentress, then look up stuff on action patterns and stuff like that. He was a wonderful individual. I had the good fortune of meeting him a couple of times at conferences, and incredibly eloquent, incredibly good thinker, sharp with things. So he's got that background of both ethology and psychology. He also spent some time working with Fred Harrington, who was one of David Metch's former PhD students. So for those of you that like dogs and wolves, we're in there as well. His PhD was on the socioendocrinology of aggression-mediated stress in timber wolves. He's currently he's currently faculty at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, where he heads up the canid and reptile behaviour and olfaction lab. Now, that's where we perhaps first have our connection, because at Lincoln, we do a lot of work on dogs and we do a lot of work on reptiles. I have a colleague, Anna Wilkinson, who does all the stuff on social learning. And I have no idea, and Anna's doing more and more stuff on dogs. I've got 4 tortoises of my own. I don't have a pet dog, which people always find strange, but it's easier to go away and do work with tortoises than it is with dogs. I'm not sure why reptiles and dogs come together. Do you? I mean, I know your dogs sniff out the reptiles, don't they?
That's exactly how it started, actually. You know, if you had asked me 10 years ago about reptiles, I would have said, yeah, what about them? And it's interesting because it's biologists at Parks Canada that asked us if we could train dogs to look for endangered species, and they happened to be reptiles at the time. That's what they were interested in. So we started working on ribbon snakes and wood turtles, and I developed a huge interest for reptiles from there. And it's mostly field-based as opposed to, you know, some of the other animals I've worked with. And yeah, so I started and although we kind of left the ribbon snakes aside, I think we worked maybe 3 years on ribbon snakes. It's mostly wood turtles that we've been working on, and I think they're fascinating. Yeah.
I mean, I do love our tortoises, you know, and the stuff that Anna's been doing with the tortoises, and, you know, stuff that they thought only primates could do 20 years ago, social learning, that sort of stuff. And she demonstrates that her tortoises can do it, even though they're not what we would consider a social species, the redfoots that she works with, but we keep them in a colony, ecologically relevant. And I think this is one of the interesting things that, and this again, maybe where you and I have similar thoughts, is, you know, thinking of the brain as this very active thing that's trying to make sense of the world. And if you keep animals in pretty sterile laboratory environments, it's not surprising that they don't show great cognitive abilities. You know, one of the things that Anna said, you know, when she looked at the literature on reptile cognition, she realized that a lot of the experiments that were done that was failing to find that reptiles could do things were on animals that were A, sort of being kept in sterile conditions, B, being tested in completely irrelevant tasks that have no ecological relevance, and C, being tested at room temperature that was comfortable for humans and not reptiles. So guess what? If I shove you in the deep freeze, your IQ goes down. And, you know, when you start to give animals the opportunity to use their brains to make sense of the world, and then actually they seem to have remarkable abilities if they're put into that developmental. And that perhaps brings us to sort of partly also why we're doing this podcast, which and you know, we'll come to all your wonderful papers and stuff probably at some point, but it came about because of a Facebook post where you said you were about to do a seminar and you were rereading Lisa Feldman Barrett's book on emotions. For those of you that are watching the video, I have a copy of it here. How emotions are made. And basically, for people who are interested in emotions, emotions have become really big in the animal training world, and everyone talks about Panksepp's affective neuroscience, and the late Jaak Panksepp was a lovely guy, and he really sort of managed to put things on. But then Lisa published this book, which is the complete antithesis of Jaak Panksepp's view. So whereas Jaak Panksepp sort of talks about affective systems, Lisa talks very much about, well, she sort of seems to want to claim that there is no such thing as emotions. There is an emotion, and whatever it is completely constructed. And you posted something saying you were rereading it, and I said, you know, yeah, I haven't reread it actually for this meeting, but the thing that struck me was that her and Jaak were talking about different things, and I've seen the two of them at a conference, and it's a shame that they weren't more, there wasn't more debate between the two of them. But Lisa's view, as far as I can tell, is very much talking about what Jaak would consider as tertiary emotions, that, you know, all the cognitive elaborations, which is a very, and, you know, in humans, that's a very complex process. And most of the animals we deal with don't have the, you know, I say, you know, Jack Russell worries about the fact that the food has fallen out of his bowl and can he get to it? Whereas we worry about the exams we've got next week, you know, and that's the, you know, and I'm just sort of surprised that it seems to have taken off in the dog world. But anyway, so maybe I better start by saying, why were you rereading the book? Maybe in case people don't know about it. But...
Yeah, I was preparing a 6-7 hour seminar for a group of dog trainers in France, and I was asked to talk about affective neurosciences in general ways. So, you know, talk about the brain, how emotions work, that kind of stuff. And Lisa's book is, well, it's a newcomer in the field, let's put it this way. But the approach is not necessarily new, in the sense that if you look at some theories of emotions from the 80s or 90s, you start seeing this kind of cognitive perspective on emotions, right? Which is kind of what Panksepp decided to react to. If you read, actually, you showed Affective Neuroscience's 1998 book. In the first chapter, he does a really good job at saying that may be a mistake to cognitivize emotions. And I think that's a valid argument. But you're also right in saying that it doesn't mean that you can have a more rational analysis of emotions. This is what animals with bigger frontal lobes and prefrontal lobes specifically will do, including this weird capacity that we have to worry about things that haven't happened yet, right? This is the curse of having a prefrontal lobe. We worry about tomorrow, we worry about next week. Sometimes I wish I were a dog, you know, so I could just live in the moment and just worry about, you know, what's in my bowl, like you said, as opposed to, you know, what could happen tomorrow or may never happen. And I think in a way, they're like two ships in the night, you know. Well, especially Lisa, I think, is kind of seeing her theory as being incompatible with Yak's theory. And I don't think that's necessarily true. I mean, she makes a lot of good points. But I think what she talks about is very anthropocentric. I don't think that, I don't think that theory glues with most animals that we study that we're interested in.
So to me, there's a few things. So first of all, yeah, she seems to build everything around, well, if there are emotions, there's positive and negative affect, and everything else is projected on. And to me, the big thing that struck me was, well, hang on, there are certain biological strategies that are quite important to animals, and emotions are quite important for that. So it's not hardwired, absolutely. And, and the thing is, people, I think, sometimes forget that, when Yak talks about his affective systems, he's talking about the basis on which things are built, the primary the primary circuits, and things are elaborated. And he talks about secondary and tertiary, and you say he talks about interaction with cognitive systems, but there seems to be an almost denial that the brain, to me, it struck me as the nature nurture argument that I was reading at, that Yak was, if you take, and I think it's a wrong interpretation of Yak to think that he was purely that nature side, because actually he does talk a lot about how emotions are elaborated, but he says there is a substrate there that is important. And I tend to say to the students now, sort of, rather than talk about circuits, let's talk about networks, because the effects are so diffuse and broad. And then you have Lisa at the other end, who is saying, well, there's this tabula rasa, and everything is projected by your experiences. And I'm thinking, no, actually, there are predispositions to care for your young that are in your brain. And I think to deny that seems, it struck me as, well, almost quite shocking, almost to sort of deny evolution in your theory of emotions, which is how it comes across. And maybe I'm misreading her, misrepresenting. But there's also this heavy dependence on fMRI, which in itself is, there's a lot of debate about what fMRI tells you and what it doesn't, because something's got to be going on in the brain for a fair while to show up on fMRI. Well, actually, neurons fire, better than me, that in a split second. So what's happening at the individual neuron level is not revealed by fMRI. And again, I think people completely miss that point. But yeah, we do interpret and we do elaborate on our emotions. But yeah, it just seems a rather extreme position. What I'm sort of curious about is I'm told, and although I've not really been on any of the forums, that in the dog world, Lisa Feldman Barrett stuff seems to have been really embraced for some reason, and I find that surprising.
I think I know why.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think, right? It's but you said it. In fact, it's you're quite right when you say it's about the nature and nurture debate, which sadly is coming back. It should have been eliminated from discussions in neuroscience and psychology and ethology a long time ago, but it's coming back, unfortunately. Because in a sense, if you look at Barrett's model, it's the good old social science model, right? Like you said, the tabula rasa, everything is constructed. And I think what's appealing to dog trainers is that it brings back the nurture part. It's all about learning, because that constructionist approach is about indeed, forget about innate behaviors and instincts, all that stuff. Let's put that aside and let's focus on learning. So that's very appealing to them because it validates the role of learning, if not cognitive stuff, but that's almost another problem. But this is misrepresenting modern biology completely, because modern biology is not anymore about, is it nature or nurture, right? And I think you've seen me cite Donald Hebb a few times. I think he had it right when he said, discussing these things, the importance of nature versus nurture is a little bit like trying to figure out what's more important in defining the area of a football field, right? Is it the length of the width?
Yeah.
Well, it's both, right?
Don't have an area without them both.
yeah, it's in a complex interaction. Sometimes it pulls more toward innate stuff, sometimes more learning. And
You don't
but
have one without the other. You know,
uh,
that's the thing.
exactly. So, and you know that what puzzles me is that one of the things that made me less comfortable about some of Panksepp's ideas is that actually, interestingly, is one of the few neuroscientists that I know that is actually quite a dualist. He's kind of a Cartesian dualist in some ways. If you look just at the appendix of his 1998 book, he talks about Eccles, Sperry, what's the other one? Not Gazzaniga, somebody else. But he clearly has a kind of a Cartesian view of neuroscience. And most neuroscientists are monists, right? The brain is the mind is the brain. But he seems to have this thing where maybe not so much, and actually it becomes even more obvious in his last book, The Archaeology of Mind, where he talks a lot about consciousness. So really, he was very much, I think, looking at all of the levels of emotions, in a sense, from the more spontaneous, what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, I guess spontaneous emotions, emotions working on their own, basically without any kind of cognitive control or assessment. But he also spent quite a bit of time talking about, just the concept of consciousness.
Yeah, and I think that was very important too. And I don't know, because when you read the 98 text, I think that was also a spiritual journey for him, with his and he makes it very clear in the introduction, the tragedy that he's been through with the loss of his daughter. And maybe that does flavor. But just to pick up on this nature nurture, because this is one of the other things which I know that you said your father was a big influence on you, and that came through Piaget, was Hegel's idea that, well, first of all, as humans, we like things to be black or white, and it makes the world simple if you've got this dichotomy. Is it nature? Is it nurture? Is it learned? Is it instinctive? And you said sort of at an early age, your father ingrained into you the idea that, well, if you think something is the case, you create a thesis around it. You look for the evidence and you support it. The next thing you have to do is create the antithesis, the antithesis of it, and look at the arguments that that's definitely not the case. And then the third step is you do the synthesis, the bringing together of the thesis, to then evaluate the evidence to try and get to the truth. And it just, when you said that to me, and I was thinking, God, yeah, that's what kids need to be taught at school. It's not a difficult idea. You put out an idea, you ask people to research it and find all the evidence in support of it. And then you say, right, now I want you to do the exact opposite, for the case, and see what you can do. See if you can make the really strong argument. And now let's see where the truth actually lies. And if we could teach kids that, then Facebook would be a much more pleasant place to be, I think. But and it just sort of, you articulated it really nicely, but you said it came really from your father, that at an early age. And I for those that obviously you didn't hear the bit that we didn't record, I said, actually, I'm quite intimidated by this, because whenever Simon speaks, he seems to be very articulate. And I think it's that clarity of thought. And you're probably very loyal to that way of thinking things, whereas I just shoot from the hip. But
well, I shoot from the hip sometimes as well, and I get in trouble for it. But
stop me.
but it's yeah. But it's I think what my father was trying to do with me, basically, and I think if I remember well, conversations with him, he got that from Piaget, is it's to always challenge your assumptions, your beliefs, your hypotheses, just always do. And I used to chat with him about stuff like animal behavior. Like all kids, I was very interested in animals, and it just happened that interest never went away. So all of my life with him until he died in 2008, we often have conversations on animal behavior. And sometimes when I was a young child, he used to do this with me, and it used to infuriate me, which is basically I would say something and he would say the opposite. And I was like, what are you doing? What? But I understood later it was kind of an exercise. It was a way of like, are you sure about this? And sometimes I would actually realize he actually agrees with me, but he's messing with me too. She's like, why are you doing this? But the good thing about it is it became kind of reflex for me, a cognitive thing where I always challenge myself, like, wait a minute, am I right about this? And a strange effect it had on me is that in the 80s, I was quite a behaviorist. Then I became a cognitivist. Then I became something that was neither. Because as I was a behaviorist, I kept thinking, yeah, but this is not working. Is it? Can it explain this? No, it can't. In fact, the first week I was at the Canadian Centre for Earth Research, I remember observing the wolves doing their stuff. And apparently, and I don't remember this, it's Janie Ryan from the Wolf Compound that reminded me of this. She was the manager of that place. I apparently exclaimed at some point in the middle of an observation, it's all limbic. And basically what I was saying is these social interactions I'm observing right now, there's nothing cognitive about this. This is all raw emotions. And learning and behaviorism is not explaining any of this. So, but you see, I think this is hard for a lot of people, including scientists, to constantly question yourself. Am I right about this? Is this the right theory? And I think a lot of people get into dogmatic approaches a lot. They get familiarized with behaviorism or behavior analysis. It works for them. They latch on it and they never question it again. And it's kind of sad, I think, because there's nothing wrong in trying to see if there's not something else out there that may be a better fit for you, the way you think about things, or even the behaviors you study.
It's also what makes things interesting is when your views are challenged, I think. And again, this is one of the joys I've had of doing these podcasts is chatting to people and listening to their perspectives. And thinking, okay, I hadn't thought of it that way. And Jean Donaldson, who you probably know, she's very much of that behaviorist school, and we were talking about the do as I do type programs, and she was sort of saying, well, we haven't done, and she's spot on. We actually haven't done the controlled experiments to work out whether or not there is anything cognitive going on, or whether or not it's stimulus enhancement and much simpler mechanisms. And again, I think that's the key thing with it. First of all, I think people like having things simple, and black and white makes things simple, whereas realizing that the reality is somewhere in the middle and we don't really know where, but we've got ideas and we can tease it out, but appreciating all those things makes it messy and complicated and hard. So they like that. And also it's easier to sell a product if you say this is the way things are, as opposed to, it's there somewhere.
Yeah, and I think, but in a sense, the dialectic of science is like that. It's like Kuhn was saying, actually, it's pendulum movements, right? We go from one extreme to the other, and eventually we find kind of a just golden middle, right? Hopefully, anyway, right? Wow. And I think, if you look at academic psychology, for instance, it's true that before the 60s, behaviorism was, engulfing psychology completely. It was, psychology was behaviorism essentially, except for a few schools like the Gestalt and, and then in the 60s, you got this amazing expansion of the cognitive thinking. And, but even that one started to being revised and challenged. And I think today, although we still call it cognitivism, I call it post-cognitivism because I kind of gel really well with some of the, not so classically cognitivist theories. Like, we earlier, you and I were talking about affordances and J.J. Gibson, for instance. I think the perception action or inactivism schools of thought have a lot of really interesting ideas, but most people in the dog world don't know about those theories. So that means it's not.
They're focused on what can I use and take into the field, as opposed to what is it important to think about that actually you can still take into the field, and it does help. And this is, with what I've been trying to do in my work by teaching people about effective networks and what I call psychobiological approach, is to think about things in terms of psychological constructs. So things like emotions and how they might be influencing it, and what level, what value is there in considering what the emotional state the animal might be. The biological is thinking more in the behaviourist tradition of what's the motivation, but actually making inferences about internal motivational state and using that information to make better assessments of the individual. And that we've sort of jumped onto several things, and whether or not we should, let's carry on going with that, because one of the there's a lovely quote from one of the chapters that you wrote. I've forgotten what the book was, but it's some neuroethics or something like that. But the chapter's called "The Four C's of Modern Neuroethology and Neuroethics: Cognition, Complexity, Conation, and Culture." And the quote that I really liked was, "The modern study of animal behavior has become nomothetic, focusing on generalization and averaging of many cases." And then say a bit more, and then you go on. "We have excised the narrative out of behavior." And because I'm, at the heart of it, I'm still a clinician. I deal with cases, I deal with individual animals with individual problems. And this is one of the things I think that has fueled my research and partly my interest in emotions, is what makes an animal an individual as opposed to a member of that species, because it responds differently to that stimulus to another dog of the same species, etc. And owners are always saying, I've always treated my dogs the same. Why is this one different? Well, there's individual variability, and it's appreciating that variability. And that's where I think, these hard issues and appreciating that things are not one or the other is really valuable in deepening our understanding. So, and for those, when in psychology, people talk about nomothetic, which is sort of research that does to understand the general rules. And it's really important work. And it's the way that scientists are trained, to do things. You take this population, you take that population, and you compare the difference. So you can find out what goes on. But if you're working with animals on a day-to-day basis, and anybody who's got a pet knows, there's an individualistic element. And a lot of the science that we do doesn't lend itself very well to that. And it's an area which I think sort of in the clinical animal behavior, we need to understand the science of one, or the individual, and those differences.
And the person that got me to understand this was actually John Fentress. He was a student of Robert Hines and William Thorpe from the Cambridge School of Ethology, from the Mattingly Institute. And I think what I like about the Cambridge approach is that first of all, they were very synthetic. They were doing much more than Oxford, for instance, a lot of integrative ethology. In fact, Lorenz was very much against their approach because of that. He thought it was a bastardization of ethology. That's what apparently he wrote in Robert Hines' book when it was researched later. They found, no, this is a bastardization of ethology. And obviously that book, which I have somewhere here, is a classic, the Robert Hines book on animal behavior, because it was indeed late 60s, the first attempt at trying to integrate psychology and ethology by saying these are not contradictions, they just need to be synthesized, basically, right? We're both right and both wrong at the same time, in a sense. But it's John Fentress that taught me that actually we don't spend enough time looking at behavior anymore. If you look at what behavioral ecologists do, the way to define behavior is often movement of populations. It's not the frame by frame analysis of a behavior anymore, or very few do this. Maybe more in behavioral neuroscience these days, for motor behavior specifically, will we still do frame by frame analysis, or second or millisecond by millisecond analysis, or maybe not millisecond, but anyway, very fine-grained microstructural analysis of behavior. But the example I give my students often to get them to understand what I mean by this is the following. I typically tell them, look, most publications on behavior, what they do is you'll have a table, and you'll have behavior A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And it will tell you behavior A was produced 24 times over a period of an hour, behavior B this many times, behavior C, etc. Okay. Then I say to them, okay, now forget about this. What does it tell you about behavior? Well, it tells you about the frequency of those behaviors within, let's say, an hour. Now, if I'm telling you that A, B, C, D, E, F, G here are actually musical notes, and what you see there is actually a song. It's a melody. And I can tell you it's a song that you know very well because you heard it when you were a kid. Most likely, your mother may have sang it to you to try to get you to sleep. What is that song? You have
this is such a great analogy. I'm going to go off after this and find a nursery rhyme, find out how many notes of the scale there are, and do this experiment with students. This is such a brilliant idea.
So I tell them, you know this song. I know you do. And over the years, I think I've used different examples, but usually it's either Au clair de la lune or Frère Jacques, because I think they're both in C anyway, so it's easy. You don't have sharps, and anyway. And obviously they can't guess. And then I say, well, this is actually Au clair de la lune, or it's Frère Jacques. Isn't it obvious? Can't you see it? But this brings home what John Fentress really spent a career doing, which is basically the idea that behavior is a thing of the individual. So that's the idiographic part, as opposed to the nomothetic part of the study of behavior. And you can't average out these things because each individual in each circumstances is different. And that's lost somehow, I think, in modern ethology, in modern psychology, even in modern neuroscience. We've lost this idea that behavior is flow, behavior is music, behavior as, like music, rhythm, melody, harmony. And if you average out things between individuals, between groups, you lose all of that, basically.
I've got a new PhD student who's actually going to be looking at that. So my new resident, actually, she's enrolled on a part-time PhD, and we're looking at, the thing we wanted to look at was the stylistic aspects of emotion. And it's exactly this that we wanted to look at. Was not, and I agree with you, I'm going off and I can't hold my thoughts, but one of the videos that I show the students is the classic one of Skinner with the two pigeons playing with the ping pong ball. And he says, and it's a true game. I'm thinking, no, it's not. A game you play because you enjoy it. They're doing this for pecks of food. And it's that, and it always struck me as a real irony that here we've got Skinner talking about behavior, and it is, his analysis of behavior is so superficial. To say, and this is a game, and you think, no, it's not. It's two pigeons who've been trained to push a ball around. That is completely different. And to make that sort of analogy, and Clive Wynne, actually, in one of these podcasts, he made the point that both Skinner and Lorenz, they worked in a very limited number of species, and then at the end of their lives decided to generalize it to all species as well, these rules. You'd never get away with that. You might, just because they've got a Nobel Prize, but but it was just, and it's quite interesting how that sort of has seeped in, that this idea that, well, they're not looking at the detail of behavior. And you're quite right. You had obviously the wonderful experience of spending a long time with John Fentress. I just met him at a few conferences. He was always really generous and willing to chat to everybody. But that was the thing that struck me was, he had this eye for behavior. And, it's what I sometimes use the term deep ethology, proper analysis. What is the real structure of what is going on? And that's what we're hoping to do in this PhD, because we're interested in, a dog moves from A to B. Well, that just tells you it moves from A to B. And, the simple thing is it, first question is it moving away from A, or is it moving towards B? Because they're different. One is you're seeking something at B. One is you're perhaps avoiding something at A. And just knowing that they are running from A to B, running is not very useful. So how can we characterize the style in order to tease out something that reliably tells us that actually the way that it is running tells us that it's running towards something as opposed to running away, or the other way around? And it's exactly that sort of musicality. So I'm probably going to be calling on you to examine this student in 5 years' time, because and people are very superficial sometimes. They sort of, well, the animal's doing this, and you think, no, I don't think so. But
you're saying a lot of interesting things here, and stuff is just bombarding my mind right now in terms of ideas. But it reminds me a little bit of the good old Schnerler withdrawal approach, something that you said that evolved over the years into some really interesting ideas, and some that were left behind, unfortunately. One that I really like is the ideas by S.A. Barnett. Barnett used to distinguish between apotreptic and epitreptic behavior in terms of approach withdrawal. And it's a really interesting idea because he had an issue with the description of conflict behavior or agonistic behavior in putting it in terms of aggression and submission. The classical way of thinking about it, because he said basically what we do here is mind reading. We're trying to figure out what the emitter or sender is thinking, what the intention is, when instead we should try to see what is the effect on the behavior of the recipient or the receiver. And basically, and it's unfortunate because it didn't catch actually as a distinction, but the way he thinks about it is apotreptic behaviors are behaviors that leads to an animal to withdraw, and epitreptic behaviors leads an animal to approach. So it's not about, again, the intention of the emitter or the sender of information. It's about the recipient and what effect or consequence it has on behavior. And what's fascinating about this is if you force students to analyze videotapes of dyadic interactions, and instead of thinking in terms of aggression submission, but instead apotreptic and epitreptic behaviors, they can't do it, because we naturally love to think about what was the intention of,
what's going on in their head. We want to focus on,
instead of what is the consequence in the actual interaction, what's the outcome of that interaction, right? And by the way, you may want to look at a book, and I'm sorry here, I have not memorized it because I just got it in the mail recently. I can't remember the name of the authors. The book is called Vigor, and I think the subtitle is The Neuroeconomics of Behavior or something like that. And it's a book that talks a lot about, to oversimplify a little bit here, what observing behavior tells us about the motivation of, it's mostly humans in that case, but I'm seeing a lot of applications potentially for animal behavior. And it's this idea, and I think John Fentress would have loved reading that book. I'm so curious to know what he would have thought. But they gave the example, for instance, that, there's a reason why when you see a friend that you haven't seen for a long time, you run towards that person and you give a strong hug, as opposed to, a stranger like, hey, how are you doing? And keeping your distances and all that. And it goes a little bit towards a book chapter that John and I wrote 20 years ago now, actually, about the prosody of behavior. Now, this idea that the intensity of behavior is meaningful, actually, right? Because John was very interested in the sequence of behaviors, that the sequential analysis and all that, Markov chains and all that complex stuff. But what him and I discussed during the 90s and what got us to write that book chapter was that sometimes we looked at some of our sequences, and this idea that AB is always followed by BC was not always true unless you looked at another dimension of behavior, which is a strong A followed by a weak B is always followed by BC, but not true if any other kind of arrangement of that musicality of behavior again. So it's about the expression of behavior as well, which is very relevant to the study of emotion or emotional behavior, as we call it. And I think it's that fine grain of behavior that, again, we've lost a lot, except maybe in neuroscience, in ethology and in psychology. And you add that dimension of expression is important, right? It's this idea that, simple example I give my students, you put somebody in the face like this. Well, you know, if you do an ethogram, this is going to be coded about the same way as.
Yeah.
Problem is, the consequence of the second one is that you're going to be knocked out or bruised really badly, as opposed to the first one where.
So for people just listening to this is punching your hand hard versus soft, in case, because if they're not watching the video, they might think, what is he up to?
Yeah.
It's the sound effects. But yeah, and that's one of the other things. So, you know, I didn't give you the full intro, but as I said, I'm sure lots of people know your work, but your work, and John Fentress is on natural action sequences. And, you know, we've already touched on the fact that the complexity of behavior, and, you know, and it brings on some of the things we've already talked about, and that people perhaps over-cognitivize things, and takes us back to Lisa Feldman Barrett, perhaps, when actually you can get very complex behavior from relatively simple behavior that has certain rules as well. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I know you talk a lot about Stewart's rules and systems, so that, you know, if you've got rules, then there's a number of key principles there, and you can start to build up much more complex, because rules allow you to mix behaviors. And again, this is one of the challenges, which I think people think about a behavior as if it's linked to a stimulus, and it's not. You know, it's there are all sorts of other influences that are coming in. But if you've only got a limited behavioral repertoire, and again, as humans, we maybe over-cognitivize all sorts of things, but I don't know how much of our behavior we do that post hoc, rather than, if you think about it, we always live in the past, because by the time we're aware of something, it's happened, for the processing. But so you've got the sort of rules allow you to sort of act very efficiently, you know, consistently. They allow adaptability, and they can be localized. So you can have that sort of, and I reread your paper on caching in foxes and wolves. And yeah, you know, if you go and bury food in wet soil, it's a pretty useless thing to do, because your food will be rotten when you want to go back. So if you have a simple rule that when your nose touches the ground and the ground is wet at the beginning, or perhaps even after you've dug a bit and it gets wet, you stop caching. And you can look at that and think, oh, isn't the animal really smart? No, it's just following, you know, it did all of these behaviors, and then something happened and said, stop doing it, because there's a simple rule there that says, if you know, from an evolutionary point of view, it's been selected for, if you carry on caching at this point, there will be no food for you in 2 weeks' time. The maggots will have got it all. And, you know, people don't think in that way, that actually you've got these units and those simple rules are just operating, and the animal isn't really thinking about it, thinking, oh, well, this isn't such a good place to bury the food, I better go here.
Which sometimes, as Lorenz pointed out very well, actually, in that example, I think that's fully quoted in that paper, if I remember well, leads to abnormalities, or something that we would perceive as such, like the young wolf that will dig a hole in the middle of the hard flooring of a kitchen, when actually there's no hole there, and then, you know, leave the bone there and walk away as if it was buried, basically, when it's not. So but there's a few elements there, and this is why I like the Fentress thinking about this, because Fentress went way beyond fixed action patterns or even modal action patterns by saying, look, it's much more complex than either of those two concepts. there's some innate stuff there, yes, but there's possible modulation through learning experience, so many environmental factors, etc. And Ian Stewart's point about rule-based systems is that the beauty of rules, in a sense, is that they're potentially flexible, because in a rule-based systems, you can always add exceptions. And that can evolve. That can be selected for or against over time. And there's not necessarily anything cognitive there. Now, it can be, because, I mean, another big contribution of psychology and neuroscience, I think, in the last 30 years is this concept also of what we call implicit cognition, right? Or implicit knowledge or implicit memory. This idea that a lot of what we think is cognitive, and in a sense is actually unconscious. We're not really controlling this the way we think we are. So yeah, it's so much more complex than the way it's often depicted or discussed in the popularization of science. And it's full of nuances, you know, like anything in science is about nuances. It's if you put nuances aside, you lose the whole picture finally.
Yeah, absolutely. A book I've just finished reading, and I did ask you just before we started whether you'd read it, so I know you haven't read it, is this book, The Idea of the Brain by Matthew Cobb. And it's a really good, what I really like it, he's a neuroscientist based at Manchester, actually. And it's basically a history of our idea of the brain. And the neat thing that he does is he basically makes the point how our view of the brain, well, there's 2 points, well, there's lots of points, but our view of the brain is very much shaped by the culture of the time. So, you know, before we knew anything about nerve cells, if you ask somebody, you know, where do you feel your emotions? Of course, they'd say in their heart, because when you feel sad, you feel it in your heart. And so, of course, the brain had no role in that, because you don't feel it up here and your brain's up here. But they knew that. So, you know, intuitively. And then, you know, as people started to develop automata, so people said, well, you know, maybe it's like a machine. And then they had telephone exchanges and they said, oh, well, you know, the plugs are like this. And, you know, and he takes you up to the computer age. And at the whole time, he's talking about the insufficiencies of these analogies, that actually the computer analogy has been with us for, you know, quite a while now, and it just doesn't work. But that's the way we tend to think about it. He then moves on to some of the sort of, the other really big thing he makes about is how, yeah, people just oversimplify things in order to try and make their point. And it's an absolutely fascinating read, because, yeah, again, it's this idea that we're seeking to make sense of the world. And so we grab for the simple explanations when clearly, you know, brains are so complex. And, you know, the brain is an active organ. It's not a passive organ. And particularly, you know, when we think about it in terms of the computer analogy, you know, the computer has the hardware there and you put stuff in and it gives you something back. And that's not how brains work. Brains are actively deciding on what it's going to select out of the environment and what it's going to actually tell you about consciously, because most of it says, I'm not going to bother you with that. And trying to think about behavior and the control of behavior in that way. And again, it's something which I sort of picked up from some of your work, this idea that actually when you think about behavior, you have to think about motivation, you have to think about emotion, you have to think about information, and you have to think about affordances of the stimuli, because brains are hungry, you know, brains are hungry for making sense of the world. I think you sort of quote Freeman, who says meaning matters to the brain, which again is a lovely expression. And it's not about the brain representing stimuli. The brain is it wants information, and knowing that there is an edge there is not information. It's a stimulus representation. It's what prediction you can make of it. There is an edge there. If you go over it, you're going to fall off the cliff. That's information. And taking the stimulus properties and seeing, well, what does that actually mean? And as I said, from information point of view, you can make simple. The affordances stuff, I think has been very extensively completely missed by people. And, you know, again, if people don't know what affordances is, the idea of an affordance is if you've got a chair lends itself to being sat upon. And that's an affordance of the chair. You know, that's the classic example. However, a chair could also be a defense weapon if you're being attacked. So it has that affordance. And it's very much, but a chair is not a seat for an elephant. If an elephant sits on it, it collapses. So it doesn't have that affordance. It is a very real property, but it's a real property that arises from the perceiver and the object. And that, I think, is what brains are doing the whole time, is they're trying to extract affordances of things, saying, what can we do with this? And what value is that? And storing that information. And it uses that information to construct our reality, which is, okay, we have a physical reality, but actually, you know, people create a psychological reality of the world that they're in based upon their perception of what is going on. This is getting very deep, actually. It's pretty good for me a Friday afternoon. But I just sort of, yeah, when I was reading some of your stuff and this stuff about affordances, I was thinking, yeah, that's really missed, and it sits in that area. It is subjective, but at the same point, it depends on the physical world for you to have those affordances. So, you know, an animal that sees something, and emotions in a way are an affordance, an emotional label of something. This is something I'm scared of. This is something I need to avoid. It's an affordance. It's a relationship you have with the world. And we perhaps haven't spent enough time thinking about, yeah, what are the affordances that the brain wants out of the world, and what predictions we can then make about their behavior.
And, you know, and what I like about Freeman, for instance, Walter Freeman, I think what he does, it's kind of also pushing the cognitivist agenda a little bit further, because he says, sure, information is important. But he goes further because he says it's meaningful information that is important to the brain, right? And a lot of his research in the olfactory system of the rabbit, for instance, addresses this, because he says some specific parts of well, actually, it's mostly the olfactory bulb, if I remember well, of the rabbit will respond to only meaningful olfactory stimuli, either innately meaningful, like pheromones, or learned, acquired meaningfulness, but will ignore all the rest. And it's not like it's not bombarded constantly by scent. It is, or you can experimentally do that, but somehow the brain won't respond to that. And I think this is a bit lost in cognitive neuroscience and cognitive ethology, even, or cognitive psychology. It's about, yeah, trying to make sense of the world, like you said. It's about meaning, and this is why I've been very much influenced by zoosemiotics, or biosemiotics, as they call it now. Which is one of the sciences of information, but a la Walter Freeman, focusing very much on what's meaningful in the environment. And actually, that goes back to the Gibsonian idea of affordance again.
Yeah.
And, you know, there's not a lot of people interested in this kind of post-cognitivist perspective right now. There's a few. Some of the people that use the term Umwelt, you know, from the old semioticians, like why am I blanking on his name?
Von
Uxküll, thank you, yes, and Sebek, and etc. I kind of acknowledge that, but I think you have to go a little bit further in that literature and the history of that movement to realize that it's quite rich. I'm trying to remember the name. There's one lady, there's one woman scientist in the US that has this perspective. I'm blocking on her name now. I'll try to get it later for you, but anyway. But yes, it's, you know, and I often tell my students, it's all about perception as well. I think I go back to this idea that the recipient has been forgotten in a lot of our research in animal behavior. It's not just the actor, it's the recipient too, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again, with the work the more work I do with dogs and other species, but particularly, most of my work tends to be on sort of dog emotions and stuff like that, is the more I've started to question that there's this explosion of work on dog cognition when actually I think we're missing a trick here. And everyone wants to get the big science paper saying dogs have this cognitive ability, when actually dogs are incredibly observant and they use relatively simple rules. And it takes us back to where we were chatting almost at the beginning, that we're over cognitivizing it. And if you can work out what the rules are, and that the animal, it can perceive certain things, then actually does become simpler. And that doesn't sing just to the behaviorist agenda of saying, well, there is no central process. There is, because the brain is actively guiding this whole process. And again, just to take another quote from one of the things that I was reading of yours before this meeting, was the quote from Louise Barrett, that it becomes very hard to decide where perception ends and cognition begins. And I just think that's such a rich, way of thinking about things, that actually, we often focus on that cognitive side when perception isn't as sexy. You're not going to get the science paper, but actually, if you think about the perception, if you think about what is meaningful for the animal, and you think about rules, then actually, a lot of things probably, I think we need to spend more time thinking about these things, because I think we will get better insights into behavior and the exceptions. But yeah, sorry.
No, I was going to say just two comments. One of them, just for people taking notes here, there's a distinction here between Lise Barrett, which is actually Lise Feldman Barrett, that's about the constructionist approach to emotions, and Louise Barrett, that is very much a post-cognitivist, embodied cognition, situated cognition kind of scientist. So they're two different people. But yeah, Louise Barrett, I think, is a rising star in the field of psychology here in Canada. I think she's a good ambassador, I think, of that perception action or inactivism school of thought that I really like. And it's interesting, going back to the dialectics of all this. In a sense, I really like I don't want to call it debate, but the back and forth between the continental European approach to animal behavior, which is quite cognitivist in the dog world. I'm thinking of the people in Austria and Hungary, particularly, and the American school, one of them being the Clive Wynne. You have this kind of like cognitivist versus behaviorist perspective, which I think is a great dynamic, because I lie somewhere in between. I think both have great points. I think Clive Wynn's group has pointed out a few really good things about some of the interpretations from the European school, like, wait a minute, this may be simpler than you think. This can be explained by conditioning. This is an artifact of training. This is, all these great points. And at the same time, the Europeans, either from Budapest or Vienna, have been right in pointing out that, sometimes there's some of these hypothetical constructs that are useful in our understanding of cognition. Or behavior in general. But that's a great example of a Kuhnian or Kuhn perspective on science, right? This pendulum movements between sometimes extremes or strong positions, and sometimes you come up to some kind of synthesis, which I think in a way is post-cognitivism. But post-cognitivism is a weird eclectic bag or basket of all kinds of different theories, right? From very connectionist neural network type of theories to, this kind of new embodied situated cognition kind of approach. You have a little bit of everything there, from very out there in the ether of, philosophical, thinking about how the mind works, to, again, the neural network approach, very computational, very close to the brain kind of thing. And I think that's what I'm reading now these days. Basically, I would say the past 5-6 years, I read mostly about post-cognitivist thinking, just because, again, it challenges my beliefs from what I, initially read in the 80s and 90s about cognitivism and about behaviorism. It just comes up at you with different ideas. And by the way, Louise Barrett's book, Beyond the Brain, that I cite in that chapter that you mentioned earlier, I think is a wonderful read. I don't agree with everything that's in there, but that's the point, right?
That's what makes it a good read.
Yeah, there are things that really bother me, and they're like, I say, no, that's not it. But actually, sometimes I've changed my mind after a few months of thinking about it. It's just, but this is why we're scientists, isn't it? I mean, it's you're not a scientist if you don't like being challenged sometimes, and the whole point of what we do is to test theories, and when you realize you were wrong, you have to say, yeah, I was wrong. Whoops.
It's interesting. One of my friends in the States, she came up. She's a vet, and she came over. She'd finished her residency, and she was doing the specialist board exams. And her supervisor, Kathy Haupt, said, you got some time, go over to the UK. You'll learn some stuff, whatever. And she spent some time with this Emily Levine, and she tells me that she went to one of our seminars where we were discussing with some psychologists something. I can't even remember what it was we were discussing, and she came out of it and she said, and we went to the bar afterwards to chat, and she said, I have never been in that sort of environment where I have seen such furious disagreement, but you're all friends. And so, yeah, that's what we do as academics. We pile in, we try to, we have the thesis, we have the antithesis, and then we try and find where the truth is at the end of it, and we don't fall out over it. And I think, that's enjoyable science, that that we look at these things, and we look for those those differences. We look at it from all perspectives and try to find the truth, as opposed to push a particular agenda.
Yeah.
And
again, I
because
think,
because vets is very much about, well, the animal's got this condition, go and do the test to prove it, and they're not used to that. We're not trained as vets to think in that way of, well, what are the alternative? Well, you obviously have your differentials, but you don't falsify. You very much look to confirm most of the time. And it's, again, me working in behavior, most of the cases that I see have seen several behaviors. So I've got to, actually everybody else's failure to sort out this dog or cat or horse or whatever is valuable information for me for trying to work out, because I can say, well, that should have worked. So it can't be that. And using that scientific approach actually is very useful when you're talking about the individual.
Well, and this is interesting what you're saying there, because you just made me think. It's true in the clinical sciences or medical sciences. I think it's Pierce. Yeah, it's the semiotician Pierce that used to say, what you often do is abduction. In experimental sciences, they do deduction or hypothetical deduction. And in ethology, which is more an observational science, we do induction. But you see, this is where I think a real integrative science should do all of these things. Induction, which is basically from observation, come up with theories. Deduction or hypothetical deduction, which is take those theories and test them. And abduction as a place there, this ability to learn to identify signs and symptoms and interpret them. These three ways of thinking in epistemology, I think, are extremely important, and they're not mutually exclusive, and they shouldn't be. And I think a lot of the fight between psychologists and ethologists, before the 70s and 80s, was a lot about that different approach. Ethologists being very inductive in their approach, observation first, and then, try to figure out what it means, versus the psychologists that were mostly experimentalists, and test theories and then challenge hypotheses. They all work together, or they should all work together.
It's interesting because just before we started this session, I was doing a tutorial with one of my PhD students, and he's actually he has a first degree in philosophy, and he's great. He's working on laterality, and we supervise as a team, which is, again, something I really enjoy. So he's got supervisors in the School of Psychology as well as Life Sciences. And we're having this conversation about, the different types of research. And this is the concern that I have, is that a lot of the research that is being presented as if it is hypothesis driven, when actually it is inductive. People are using, complex statistics and saying, oh, and age is important. So they call the paper the effect of age on such and such factor. The study wasn't designed to do that. It tumbled out from the statistics. And that is actually sloppy science, because, if it was designed to, if you really want to test the effect of age, then you should have worked out what your samples, and you should have gone and targeted animals of this age and this age and this age. And just because it tumbles out from the statistics doesn't make it, and, it's that sort of, a lot of what is being presented as, hypothesis testing or is actually much more hypothesis exploring. And I often, one of the conversations we talk about is, p-values and whatever, and statistical correction. And I said, well, given where you are in the process, I wouldn't do a statistical correction, because you're just interested in anything that might be important at this point. And if you do a statistical correction, you won't see those things. But what you can do then is, having done that first study, now you do it again, but this time you've got a hypothesis you can test, and you calculate your sample size and you test it. Oh, yeah, but I have to do the same experiment twice then. Yes, you do. But once was exploratory and once was confirmatory. They're different processes. And it's one of the, I think, advantages, and I don't know what the system is in Canada, but, in the UK, we have a thesis for a PhD. You don't have to have any papers published to get a PhD. What you have to do is show the journey you've been on and that you're an independent researcher. And I'd say one of the pluses of that is you can get people to go through that process, and exploratory and then confirmatory studies. On the continent, then you have to have 2 or 3 papers published, and they form your thesis. And there are advantages of that. First of all, you get experience of writing papers and things like that. But there is a danger that, you let the statistics turn something out and you turn it into a paper. And that, I think, is a concern. What is the situation in Canada?
It's hybrid. It used to be the British way. In fact, we Canadians were kind of stuck between the UK and the US in some ways, because sometimes we do one or the other, or kind of or a mix of both. Again, kind of a synthesis, I guess. It used to be the UK way, I would say. Now we are often, most programs, I think, give options to the student. Do you want to do the traditional thesis, or do you want to do the 3-paper type thesis?
Okay.
So it's a choice. I think some departments are moving to go with the published 3 papers for your degree, and that will be it. And I think the idea there is a practical thing, right? Is so the student gets published.
Yeah.
So I don't know. And this kind of hybrid where you write those papers, you publish them, but then you package them into some kind of unitary document, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't.
I think that's true. I just had a thought, because I don't know how long we've been talking, probably about an hour. And, this has actually been, I've loved it. It's been fairly intense. So what I'm going to suggest is that we take a break, and we will sort of cut the video at this point or whatever. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about perhaps more light things, because a lot of people who listen to this are, they're dog trainers, and I want to talk to you about some of the doggy stuff, because, rather than I could spend all evening chatting to you about the philosophical stuff, and we will come back and we will catch up, and we probably will do this seminar after this, but
we should. I remember the first time I met you, And I think we crossed paths at one of the CSF conferences at some point. I forget which one, but we spent quite a bit of time together at actually one of the CSFs, when the one that was in Vienna, when we ended up going visit the Wolf Research Center there with Friederike and Sofia. Yeah, I remember that very well. Yeah.
So let's take a break.
Yep.
And then we'll come back and we'll talk about some of the issues that, I think we probably share some of the concerns, and talk about some of the issues in relation to the dog world. Okay.
Sure. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot.